Well, it is time for 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And I got to admit, this chapter really did a number on me. Spoke to me. I can relate to a lot of what Paul says in this chapter. Let's see if you can relate too. You know, I'm going to give you a Greek vocabulary lesson. I don't do that very often. I do snippets, but in English, preach and teach sound a lot alike. You ever think about that? What's the difference between the two? I mean, they even seem to have similar meanings, right? A preacher's teaching people. A teacher tends to preach. In sign language, you teach or you preach. However, in Greek, those two words don't sound anything alike. And their meanings are not really that similar. The Greek word for teach is didasko. This is the word, it's used in the manner of referring to a teacher in a classroom or a philosopher teaching his disciples. It's a word that Paul uses many times, including in 1 Corinthians 2, 4, 11, 12, 14, 15. Jesus used it all the time in the Gospels. Didasko, teaching. The word Paul uses in this chapter is euangelizo. Euangelizo. Whatever. My Greek is better reading than pronouncing. The root word is basically good news and evangelize. Paul used this word in 1 Corinthians 1, 9, and 15. I went and searched through the Greek version of this Bible, for these two words. Not just 1 Corinthians, the whole Bible, New Testament. You know, we often translate euangelizo as preach, but that's actually somewhat of a poor translation. It should be translated as evangelize when it's used as a verb. When it's used as a noun, it means good news. When used as a verb, it means evangelize. And that's how Paul uses it in this chapter and some other places. Paul says, I am as free as anyone. I am a true apostle. I saw Jesus our Lord personally. You are the proof of the work I have done for the Lord. Some may not consider me as an apostle. Surely you know I am an apostle. You are the proof that I am the Lord's apostle. So if you start by reading this chapter, or as you start reading this chapter, if you do it without considering context, it probably seems a little bit of an overreaction by Paul. It seems very defensive, like someone is attacking his right to preach the gospel. However, read this chapter in context. You got to go clear back to 1 Corinthians 7. There, Paul says he's going to address topics the Corinthians had asked about in the letter they had sent him, as I mentioned. He talked about being married and sexual relationships. If you're single, stay single. If you're married, stay married. If you got an unbelieving spouse, stick with them if they want to stay. Slaves, free or not, believing in food offered to idols. Consider this chapter following all of that. Doesn't it seem as though Paul might be addressing another question the Corinthians had asked him? Now, what would that question be? It seems like some people were challenging his status as a preacher, an apostle. This isn't the first time Paul's had to defend himself, his spiritual status. I mean, the first epistle he wrote was Galatians, and Galatians 1:11 through Galatians 2:10 contains an account of Paul's acceptance as an apostle, not just by our Lord, but by the apostles left out of the 12. They were in Jerusalem, and the other elders there in Jerusalem. 2 Corinthians 10, which is written after 1 Corinthians, seems Paul's defending himself again. This time it appears some said Paul was timid when he was in front of them, but became bold when he was writing, not having to face them. I thought that. 2 Corinthians 11, the next chapter, also contains a response defending himself apparently against some who claimed he wasn't a true apostle. So here Paul is making it straight. The Corinthians, they are the proof he is Christ's apostle, and they know it. So let's read verses 3 through 6. If some want to challenge my authority, here's my response. I have the right to receive support, such as sharing your meals. I have the right to bring a believing wife with me, just like other apostles and our Lord's brothers, including Peter. Or does anyone want to say Barnabas and myself are the only preachers who can't receive help? I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd want to confront Paul. You know what I'm saying? Some have claimed that verse 5 says Paul was married. 1 Corinthians 7:8, which we covered a couple lessons back, says Paul is not married. He said, I wish you'd stay single just like me. So is Paul married? Some even go and say the Bible's wrong, and this is an example. Or some say Paul was being deceitful or whatever. Stop and think for a moment. 1 Corinthians 7:8, when I use words, I mean what they mean when I say them. And I'm a computer geek. I mean, very seriously computerish. It drives my wife nuts. When I use a word, I use it for the exact meaning it has, not a wishy-washy meaning. Greek is even more specific than English, even the way I use it. 1 Corinthians 7:8 clearly says Paul is not married. Now look again here at 1 Corinthians 9:5. Does it say Paul is married? Nope. It does not. Paul says he has the right to bring a believing wife with him. He is saying he has the right to bring a believing wife, not that he has a believing wife. And just to complicate things, there are a couple other possible explanations I can give you. My logic mind extrapolates. Perhaps Paul had a wife who had died, or Paul had a non-believing wife. So in 1 Corinthians 7:8, Paul is saying that he is living like a single person. Well, he's on the road. And in those days, you didn't fly home every night or every weekend. In verse 7, Paul says, yes, does a soldier have to pay his own expenses? Do workers plant vineyards and not eat some of the grapes? Do herders keep a flock of animals and not drink the milk from their animals? Of course, no soldier has to pay for his own traveling expenses and meals. No one working a vineyard doesn't eat some of the grapes. And no herdsman doesn't drink the milk from the animals. I mean, come on. Paul says in verses 8 through 10, I am not depending on these real-world examples. Moses' law says the same thing. Don't muzzle an ox to keep it from eating while it walks on the grain, turning a millstone. Was God implying this applied only to oxen, or was he teaching us a lesson? He was teaching us that workers should be allowed to share in the harvest. Seems straightforward to me. Verses 11 and 12, Paul says, if we have planted spiritual seed among you, is it asking too much for us to receive physical support from you? If other preachers have the right to receive physical support from you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to that same support? Can you see the Corinthians, at least some of them, nodding their heads in agreement as Paul states that if they support other preachers, then they should be willing to support him even more? Yeah. Paul is reminding the Corinthians that they are the proof that he is Christ's apostle. This whole section. He said, he says, however, we did not ask for physical support. He says, no, we dealt with our physical needs ourselves. So there'd be no complaints that might detract from the gospel of Christ. Don't you think even more Corinthians began to nod their heads in agreement as Paul points out he never asked them for support? And they realized that was the truth. Really? Paul got support sometimes. Acts 18, just right at the beginning, it tells us that Aquila and Priscilla arrived in Corinth soon after Paul did, and they were tent makers just like Paul. And so Paul worked with them and supported himself that way until Silas and Timothy showed up. Evidently, they brought enough that Paul could stop working as a tent maker and devote himself to full-time preaching. That's what Acts 18 says. But Paul's not done. Verses 13 and 14. Oh, man. Ready? Buckle your seatbelt. Put on your steel-toed shoes if you think Paul didn't have a right to be supported. Paul says, don't you realize that people serving in the temple eat their meals from what is brought as offerings? Don't you realize that those who serve at the altar receive a share of the offerings? Wow. Think about it. He continues, following that example, the Lord has commanded us that those who preach the gospel should be supported. I mean, Jesus himself had somebody supporting him, probably a lot of people. He never had a job once he left his father, earthly father, the carpenter. Paul continues defending himself with another real-world example. People serving in the temple eat food that is offered as sacrifices. Did he need to remind the Jews in the group? Leviticus 6, 16, and 26, and Deuteronomy 18:1. It commands the priests and Levites are to eat from those offerings. Verse 15, Paul says, you know that I never used my right to receive report. I'm not writing now to ask you for your support. I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching the gospel to you without asking for support. Well, Paul has already stated outright that he is trying to shame the Corinthians about other things. Do you think he's trying to shame them here? He says, I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching the gospel to you without asking for support. No doubt many of the Christians would have felt shame right about here. We treated him like that. Man. Paul says, preaching the gospel, verse 16, preaching the gospel isn't something that I boast about. I feel compelled to evangelize. If I couldn't preach the gospel, I would feel terrible. Do you understand what Paul's saying here? I seriously doubt very many modern Christians understand this verse. Or am I wrong? It is about evangelizing, and that's what Paul's life is all about. Can you hear Paul's thoughts? I don't know what I would do if I couldn't preach the gospel. That would be horrible. What would I do? I can't even imagine doing anything else. I have to do this. I can't stop myself. He's going to continue to explain this a little bit better in 17 and 18. He says, if I'm doing this voluntarily, I will be rewarded. People, I had a hard time paraphrasing the rest of this chapter, starting right here. If I am doing this voluntarily, I will be rewarded. If I'm not a volunteer, then I'm doing it because I have been given a mission. So what is my reward? Preaching the gospel is my reward. And I do it for free so that I don't have to demand my rights. Oh, people, this is me talking now, not Paul. Preaching the gospel is something I understand. I have sacrificed much to do exactly that. And I have no regrets. I'm not famous. I don't have a lot of followers, but I feel compelled to continue preaching past the age when most pastors retire. Most people retire. Well, most pastors do. They call me old. Like, I say this often. It's amazing how often I go someplace and I'm the oldest person there. And I don't think I'm that old. I'm just 70. Like, I guess all the 70 plus sit at home more. I don't know. I do that a lot these days, working on that. But like the Apostle Paul, I will retire when I go to heaven. My greatest prayer is that others will follow Paul's example, his passion. (19 to 21), Paul says, I am a free man and no one controls me. I have made myself a slave to all people so that I might win as many as possible to Christ. To Jews, I lived like a Jew so that I might win Jews to Christ. To those who follow the Jewish law, I lived like one under the law, even though I'm not under the law. I did this in order to win those under the law to Christ. To those not under the law, I became like them, so I might win them to Christ. I have personally learned how to talk to almost anybody. I can talk to street people and I can talk to highly educated people. I can talk to wealthy people and poor people. I know the vocabulary, the manner of speaking, their languages, because I have done my best to be like them, to understand them. Not to be wealthy like somebody or poor like somebody, but to understand them, to be able to relate. That's what Paul's talking about. Dear Christian, if you want to go into all the world and share the gospel message, like Jesus said, you need to be able to relate to the people that you're going to. That's why missionaries often live with the one specific people group. Some spend their whole life, 40, 50 years or more, in one little tiny village, oftentimes only having a very few Christian converts. Because they become like them. They live like them. No indoor plumbing, no electricity. Others go to cultures where, they have indoor plumbing and electricity, but if you say, I'm a Christian, they'll kill you. Yeah, you got to learn a whole different way of being a Christian. And that's what Paul was doing. He continues in verses 22 and 23. He says, when I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness so that I might win them to Christ. I do my best to relate to everyone, doing everything possible so that I can save some. I do everything in order to spread the gospel and its blessings. Do you think Paul thought about sharing the gospel every day of his life? Duh, yeah. How often do you think about it? I guess I really am preaching tonight, huh? Paul says in verse 24 to 27, you know what it's like in a stadium watching athletes race? Everyone competes, but there's only one winner. If you are going to compete, then run with the intention of winning. Serious athletes train hard so they might win a gold medal that will eventually fade. We race for an eternal reward. How about you? What do you think, people? Are you serious about running this race? That's why I put everything I have into this race. Can you hear Paul saying that? Pushing as hard as I can to reach the finish line first. I discipline myself and train myself. Paul did that. Read Philippians 3. He says, I do not want to be found lacking when I have preached to everyone else about this race. Can you relate to what the Apostle Paul is saying here? Becoming a Christian takes a commitment. Some, not too much of a change in life. They grew up in a good Christian family. Others, it's a big change. Their friends and family aren't going to understand. Paul had family and friends that didn't understand. He went from trying to kill Christians to being one and trying to get everyone else to be. If you are a Christian, God bless you. But I think what Paul's asking here in 1 Corinthians 9, or suggesting, is that you make another commitment at a higher level. Are you ready?